All right, so if you can mute your mic. I'm going. All right, so let's continue on with HTML. Intro to HTML. All right, so HTML syntax. So we already went over the fact that every HTML element has a open tag and closing tag and has some content in there, and the browser will quickly interpret that and know what to do with it. And as you saw in the exercises 1 and 2, you don't necessarily need a full document. You just can have a very static page, right? You can have a HTML element that just has a couple tags in there, and the browser will try to piece it together based on its interpreter or engine. It'll know what to do about it. So very important. All right, so some other element examples. Some HTML elements that have no content, like the break element. So these elements are called empty tag elements. So there's a whole bunch now. Remember, we're at HTML5 now. So if we really got used to the syntax, there's a lot of older tags that are depreciated that I still remember. It's not best practice, but sometimes I go back to them because they're so easy. I wouldn't do it in my normal day job because we go through code review and then there'll be best practices. But if I have to do freelance work and I need to make something work, and I don't have a UX designer or someone to give me some nice styles, and I gotta make it work myself. Sometimes I revert back to some of these old tags just to get it done. But so yeah, these are called empty elements. They don't have any content, and they don't need an end tag sometimes, right? So if you look at here, we haven't really gone over it, but there's something called a header tag, H1, and we'll go over that. We'll go over some of these tags maybe in the next session, but that makes that first header really big. Paragraph, obviously, paragraph, we have the start tag, the content, end tag. Now the break tag. So that has no closing tag. Right, so if we quickly went back to that one, what did we do here? Somewhere on the desktop, we're having that problem with, what was it again here? So if I go to HTML example 2, so I had some problems with some of this stuff. So let's see here if I can quickly save this again. All right, so I'm gonna save this as a .html. Remember, you need to do that. And my browser needs to quickly open that up. Let's quickly do that. So bear with me here. All right, was it this one here? No, that's not this one, but we'll make it this one. So let me do save as and overwrite it. HTML, remember, don't save it as a text file. Let's say overwrite it. All right, refresh it. So this is our problem here. So what we could do here, and remember, HTML is going to end up sometimes looking like this. It's all going to be unformatted. You might get a file like that. It looks awful. But you don't need necessarily to go into adding paragraphs all the time. Sometimes you can just add a break tag on the end. You could close it like that. So let's refresh it. And if we quickly refresh it, we can put this on another line. It's in older tags, it's used, but sometimes people would prefer putting everything in its own paragraph tag. Let's not close it. Let's just see how it looks. All right, so it kind of gives a perception of a paragraph. I mean, the right way to do it is to wrap things in paragraphs to prevent all these break tags. Sometimes you'll see this kind of thing going on, right? Lots of break tags to give space. Yeah, you could do that. That's not wrong, but at the same time, when you learn CSS, cascading style sheets, there's a way to eliminate all of this extra tag work, right? So know about that. You don't necessarily need to close all of them. There's a bunch of other ones like that as well. So a question here, I can open my window here. Fine. The second exercise can be done with a P in 2 spans only. No BR required. Used. Yeah, right. Sure, but we haven't got to CSS yet, so we're playing with HTML tags. Yeah, we're pretending we don't know about CSS because some people don't, but for sure. I mean, there's many ways to skin a cat, so they say. But for right now, we're pretending we are in 1999 and when there is no CSS. We're just learning markup right now. But yes, Natasha, that's true. Yeah, we're starting from the basis of we're learning just the view. We don't know any other way to do this, right? So we're going to rely on our elements. But we're looking ahead. We can use a lot of styling to accomplish many things. And I'll show you some old school examples that I would revert back to. There's some issues and problems that are still relevant today, but there's toolkits for them. But you're right. But let's suspend reality for a little bit and pretend that all we know about is HTML, and that's what we know, and that's what we're working through, and that's what we're gonna kind of go from there, right? So break tag could be used to break up text. That's what it is. Break, break tag, break up, not make up. So nesting of elements. So once you get into a lot of HTML, you're going to see a lot of nesting of tags, and it can get very confusing. Which, when you're developing, it's always great to have. And if you're not a programmer, you may appreciate this. When you have style and indentation, meaning things are indented in your code, so you can see a nice separation of parent-child. We'll reference a tree structure, if you can imagine. Some of that indentation, it makes sense to the visual eye, because in your editors, you can also collapse and expand, and you can kind of see the structure. And there's going to be a lot of nesting going on. And this is a very simple example, but you may have very deep nesting of HTML elements. And without collapsing them, it would be very unreadable, because sometimes HTML pages can be thousands of lines long, right? We're doing very simple examples, but when you get very big pages, the basics are still there. I mean, you have to understand by eye what those tags do. But usually when you have markup done once, it doesn't change that often once you get it right. There may be some small tweaks and stuff like that, but markup, unless they do a whole page redesign, once it goes through an iteration and a proof, the HTML markup doesn't change that much. But anyhow, there's going to be nesting involved. So if we wanted to state that in our example, our cat is very grumpy with a bold text, we have that option. We could wrap the inner content with the strong character. We could actually nest tags in for every single letter of that very, V-E-R-Y. We could do that if we wanted to. It doesn't make that much sense. And what I'm saying is that if we wanted to do something like, strong, okay, so I'm not going to do that one. Let's go across new. I mean, we could do this, right? We could, and as I start typing here, you're going to understand why we might want to look at Visual Studio Code, right? Because it's starting to get very unreadable, isn't it? A little bit, because it's all text right now. Did I do that right? No, I think I ended it. Yeah, so even now I'm looking at that, I'm kind of figuring I can't really tell what's going on. It's a little bit hard on the eyes, right? And what I mean by indentation is, all right, so what I mean by that is when you start getting the nesting, you want to say, okay, this is the parent element. This right here is, if I can tab properly. No, it's not gonna let me tab in Notepad for some reason, but anyhow, again, this is why you might want to use Visual Studio Code, because it's hard to make that out, right? I can't even tab properly. I don't know. Okay, there I go. Right. So right there to the visual eye, you can kind of tell that this tab, this is the parent element. This is the end to that parent element. Now we have a bunch of nested tags. again, I could do this for each letter, but why do I want to? It has the same result as wrapping the whole string itself, right? So going back to this, this kind of thing, right? So that's what we're after. So that's nesting can get multi levels deep. So my point was there's no right and wrong way to do nesting. In that example, we opened that first P element here. Right here, we opened it. Then we added the strong and that child element, and we closed it. And then we closed the parent P element. So the following is an example of a wrong way to do nesting. Yes, this is wrong because you have the P, you open the parent, you open the child, you close the parent, and then you close the child. So this kind of will, that's the wrong way semantically to do it, right? The tags have to be open and closed in the way that they are inside and outside of each other. So you kind of have like I'm not going to say scope, but you kind of get my drift, right? And when you're using an editor, especially like Visual Studio Code, it'll enforce it to the eye. The browser won't necessarily throw an error, but you will see it in Visual Studio Code because you'll have a lot of overlapping things, and the browser has to guess at your intent, right? Because the browser, we already showed you, will give it unexpected results. So let's again try to do something like that. So they're saying if I added P here, I close the parent tag off, and at the bottom of this all, I did this. Now again, already I'm already having problems with this, so I want to open Visual Studio Code up because this is killing me right now. As I'm trying to explain it to you, it's not making any sense to me because I don't want to look at that anymore. Especially, you'll see why in a second. Let's let it chug. Hopefully, it'll open up quick. All right, let's see. Hopefully, you can see my Visual Studio Code as it's opening. All right, maybe we'll give it a couple seconds and we'll come back to this because it's going to take a little while to open. But I'll show you why nesting is important and how an editor such as that will help you with this. And then we're only dealing with a couple lines here, but again, when you deal with thousands of lines of code, you'll appreciate it a little bit more. So block versus inline elements. So two important things to remember about elements in HTML are block level elements and inline. So block can form any visible block on the page. This is kind of the definition. A block level appears on a new line, followed by the content that precedes it. Any content that follows a block level element also appears on a new line. Block level elements are usually structural on the page. So for example, a block level element might represent a header, heading, paragraph, a list, navigation menu bars, footers, right? Those block elements won't be nested inside an inline element. They need to be nested inside of other block elements. So you could have a paragraph and a subparagraph with a header and so on and so forth. So it gives the page a visual blockiness, right? So as you would be reading a Word document, you would expect it to kind of have spacing in between that block. Inline elements, well, inline elements are contained within those block level structures. Those elements surrounded by small parts of the document's content. So not entire paragraphs or groupings. So inline element will not cause a new line to appear. It won't have space above it or below it. So typically it's used with text, especially with hyperlinks. And as you already used that EM tag or strong. And this is kind of an example of it. So we have if you notice, our inline element here. EM first, EM second, EM third, as you can tell right there, it doesn't put any spacing around it, doesn't do anything special, just kind of is in line and it doesn't add much to it. But when we add our block element here for fourth, fifth, and sixth, you can tell that it adds this nice spacing between it, right? And you can imagine if you have 100 characters of text and you're reading some kind of news website, how important that is. So the EM is an inline element, as you see below. The first three elements sit on the same line, no space between them or around them. On the other hand, these block elements, such as the paragraph, appear on a new line with space above and below. So spacing is due to the default CSS styling that the browser applies to paragraphs. So we did notice that when we looked at the browser, that there was some kind of spacing going on in the browser. So let's quickly check if my Visual Studio Code did open, and it did, thank God. And we're just looking at some other code here. We might have looked at that a little while ago, but as you can already tell, it had, and I'm talking about indentation to the eye, you can kind of see, right? This is not, kind of skipping ahead here, but this is not HTML. It's kind of a quasi mix of it for React, but you can tell that this is a parent, and this is a nested child, and this is a nested child, and so on and so forth. Getting a little ahead of ourselves. But as in our example that we had, right, for this example here, that if I quickly copy paste this already, I get some, the tags are highlighted, right? So already I can tell that this right here, I can't tell really what's going on. You know, I can understand it, but it's very easy to skip a close tag, right? Whereas here, you can kind of tell like already the tags are highlighted. And also if you hover over it, you get some IntelliSense about this kind of tag. The BR element represents a line break. So you can use this because it's hard to remember what these tags do. You know, the I represents the span or text and alternate mood or voice. All right. So that's another benefit of using this. So you don't need it, but as your text files get bigger, you're gonna want to use it, to be honest. We're only dealing with HTML. Once you add CSS, JavaScript, all that stuff, the editor will highlight those regions differently. So to the eye quickly, in a 1,000-line file, you can quickly go to the section you need to. Plus, as you start going, you'll see that sometimes you'll be able to collapse elements as you go through this, and I'll show you that in a little bit. So that kind of gives context to that, right? To why we would use that. So HTML comments, which was our question exercise 3. If you struggled through that and you figured it out or you didn't understand it, well, now we'll go over it. So HTML comments. So HTML has a mechanism to write comments and code, which is very good for developers. Developers sometimes need to comment very, I would say, only use comments when you need to explain or organize your code. So if there's some piece of logic where, you know, maybe it's something like, you know, something like a mathematical calculation for a banking thing, like, okay, for instance, if you're not from Canada, we have a special tax here called HST, which is 13%. And, you know, and you explain that, you know, this tax is only applied, sorry, not 13%, our taxes are 6 and 7%. They're actually broken up into 2 different types, GST and HST. Yeah, we get taxed heavily. But anyhow, to explain it, right? If you are in Canada region and you're buying something from a shopping cart, you need to apply the tax of that region. Whereas if you're into Quebec, they also have something called QST on top of that. So that would be something to comment, because that's something a developer would need to know, especially if the checkout is international, right? You need to apply different kind of taxes on the items, right? So that would be a good reason to put a comment in. For HTML, you might not put that, but maybe you would say, this section of code is for the Canadian taxes, right? And this only gets hide shown when the region is Canada. Otherwise, it defaults to USD, right? So that would be a reason to comment. Or there could be, I don't advocate it, but sometimes I've seen some quite funny comments like, I don't know what this does here. Don't remove it. Oh, okay. At least somebody left me a note. That's very helpful, because otherwise I would just get rid of it, right? Right, so browsers ignore these comments. It's more for the developer, but you could still view it in the source code. And you could actually view some, I have to look up some sites, and you'd see some code, some comments in there. But effectively, the comments are invisible to the user in the browser. They won't notice unless you look for it. Purpose of comments to include notes to explain your logic or coding. It's usually very useful. to the code base after being away for long enough and you don't completely remember it. So so they're very, yeah, it's very invaluable to people making changes and updates. Now, mind you, there should be a source control where you could look back on a file, see the updates and the comments, but you know, sometimes you don't have that luxury and it makes sense to put some comments in there. So that's what this is. So to write an HTML comment, you have to put it in this syntax. You need to have that open angle bracket with the exclamation mark or bang, whatever you want to call it, and then 2 dashes, not 3, and then your content, and then close it up. There's other ways to do comments, but for HTML, we'll just stop there. So anyways, this is one example of the paragraph, and then here this is hidden, and if you were to output it inside of a browser, you would not see this part here. But it's very easy to mess that up. It's very easy to include 3, and we can try that out in our new but old editor, right? So we'll just say, all right, we'll say, you know, this, you know, we can replace this BR tags with CSS eventually, right? Now, if we put another tag here, some people can use tags like that in some languages, but we're not going to do that. I always get mixed up. All right, so what happens if I put 3? Right, what happens if all right, let's see what happens there. Will the browser understand it? Will the browser mess up? So it basically kind of ignored it either way. If we use our developer tools and we try to inspect something here, maybe it's not, see, you can tell that it's hidden. Now, sometimes if the developer does not close it properly, you will see comments floating around in there. But as you can tell right now, it's ignored, which is great. So if I were to say, if I was a bad developer, meaning not saying everyone's bad, but if I said, okay, well, I don't know, Azure API key equals, you know, X, Y, Z, and password, you know, equals 1, 2, 3. Well, I would say don't do that. That's probably something you shouldn't be putting in your comments because somebody could rip that out if they found it and try to log into your Azure account, which is a cloud. You could say database, right? My database username and admin credentials is this. I've seen that before. To be honest, you don't want to do that. All right. So enough about that. Comments are self-explanatory, but you know what? It's worth noting. So empty elements. So not all elements follow the pattern of an open tag, content closing tag. Some elements consist of a single tag, which are typically used to insert or embed something into the document. For example, this image tag. So we haven't really gone over this, but this image will embed an image onto the page. So we have a image tag with a source. So this, we haven't talked about this yet, but there is something on each element called attributes. And some HTML tags, many have attributes on them. There's a list of attributes. And for instance, this image has a source attribute, src. So the browser will look at this tag and say, okay, I expect an image. I'm getting ready to display it. I need to know where the source is. Sometimes it can be on the server internal, but in this case, it's an external image that we're pointing to GitHub content and this Firefox. PNG, so the browser knows to embed that image inside your HTML document. Smart enough to go ahead, grab it, and download it inside your document. And it doesn't have a closing tag. And that's called an empty element because there is no content in between the tags. It is a self-containing tag that has a self-containing attribute that does something. And there are many more instances of attributes there that we could dig into. All right. So let me quickly just look at that before, if I had any developer notes here. No, I didn't have any on those. All right. Right, so we'll get into the structure of the document. So we've just been looking at elements by themselves.
Excuse me, Mike.
Yes, yes. Sorry, I didn't see your hand
Mike.
because I can't see my comments
Yeah,
here.
yeah, that's okay. I don't know. Could you please take us back a little bit on the comments?
Yes.
Because I did it and it didn't work. It got hidden. I don't know if I did something wrong. I'm so sorry about that. If you can just throw more light on it so I can understand it.
Sure, no problem. Yeah,
Thank
so
you. The best.
the point is, it should be hidden. It should be hidden. Like it should not be publicly exposed. That's the point. So if it was hidden, then it worked. Then it worked for you. So what it is these are developer comments, right? Developer comments that you don't necessarily want to be exposed to the browser, but sometimes you may see some in there. But ideally the browser should hide them, right? So if you can see my hello HTML, let's take a look at that. Maybe because I didn't refresh it. Let's see. Hello HTML. All right. Oh, where's this guy here? Sorry, I was doing it correctly. All right, so sorry, I was using a different example here. Let's put this tag in here. I wasn't previewing it properly. Thank you for that. All right, so paste it, go back, refresh. All right, so let's inspect it here. This is going to be in bold text, right? So right above here, right above all these things, we don't see that comment there, so that's good. So it's meant to be for documentation, those comments. So if you
Okay.
don't see them anywhere, then you did it right.
Okay.
And that's what you should remember. It's more for your development team, and your own kind of workspace, to be honest. So you're going to use comments a lot, and when you get into JavaScript, there's another way to do it. But anyhow, yes. So ideally, you don't want comments that give any type of information out to the user, because there are hackers out there, and there's so much security out there. The last thing you want to do is do something you don't want to expose the company or the network that you're on by putting some information in comments, right? So the fact that the browser hides it is a good thing. And maybe I'll just leave it at that. I can just go on from there. But okay, so carrying on from that, we talked about elements, and we've only been really concerned about how small elements are interpreted by the browser. But really, when we're talking about a document, we want a structure. So we want a structure to the HTML. And this is what an HTML document will look like. It has this doc type right here. It has a parent. The top level tag is HTML, right? And it needs to close it. Then there's something called a header, the header tag of the document, which is what the browser will pull and look at first. There's a whole bunch of information in there, and this is a very small amount, but the title will show up in the title window. And then inside of your body is where you start to add all the content for your page. So to explain a little bit more, the doc type HTML declares the definition that this document is an HTML5 document. Some other doc types might be XML, right? There's a whole bunch of other ones. XML is a different kind of payload. XML is more like a server-side kind of rendering. It's not really meant for the web, and it's a different structure. I forget the other ones, to be honest. I gotta look it up. But they're kind of more older school ones. But if you're working on the desktop, you may be using XML. So it needs to tell the browser what it is. So the doc type could be that And then there's HTML element in the root of the HTML page. The header contains the metadata, meta information about the page. So for instance, we can get into that, but there's an attribute on this meta tag, character set UDF8. So that's character. UDF references some of the characters. And again, this is stuff that you may not necessarily need to do. If you do it, you do it one time. It's more for the browser when it loads up. You'll probably spend most of your time inside of the body. Inside of the header can also be where you register all of your CSS cascading style sheets, where you make references to maybe there's some JavaScript libraries or other kind of things that you want. So all that goes in the header tag for the browser. The title is self-explanatory. It specifies the title of the page, which is shown in the browser's title bar or in the tab, right? So when we are looking at my tab here, you can tell somebody right there, like you can tell sometimes it'll default to the name of it. It's like right there, I can see HTML1. I don't want the title of my page to be HTML anything. I just want to have a nice title like, okay, session 1 or whatever, Blackboard, right? Like these are the title elements of the page. And you can make it, see for this one, I'm hovering over that. It gives a nice description and it has a nice lowercase kind of website so that if you're hovering over, it makes a little bit more sense to what you're looking at. And that's for the browser itself. The body definition is where we've been kind of working. I haven't told you we've been working inside the body, but that's where it ends up. These elements so consider the body as like a container for all of the child elements that we will be building, and this can be quite large. Inside the container, all the visible visual elements such as headers, paragraphs, images, hyperlinks, tables, the list is endless. Even forms, we'll get into data forms. We need a way to extract user information. There's all sorts of stuff. There's all sorts of tags. And to be honest, I'm not gonna go over every single tag with you. I'm gonna show you eventually the reference material, and a lot about HTML really is using the reference, because there's a lot of tags out there, and true 90% of the time you're gonna use the same ones, but the odd time you'll need a special one, or you'll come across one you don't understand. I always encourage everybody, always look at the documentation. I'm even guilty of this, even on my day job. Sometimes I want to figure it out myself, but sometimes you need to look at the documentation because it's already there. And there's examples, right? And it can save you a ton of time. And then H1 is a large header element. Now, not to be confused, this head tag with this heading, right? So this is the browser head, and this is the heading tag. So a heading tag is large font. As we notice here, this is a heading, right? We have a nice document structure here, a doc type, HTML, right? HTML header tag with some metadata. Here is our title, which should be represented inside of our title of the browser. And then inside of the body tag, we have a simple header right there. So with that being said, I may have already mentioned documentation. So MDM, there's one for JavaScript, there's one for HTML, there's one for, there's documentation for React, there's documentation for MongoDB. Everything that we will be looking at, it's very good documentation on the web. That's why I say I would say you don't need to buy a book. If you pay attention to the documentation, that's what the professionals really do, to be honest. Let's see here, I have some questions, if I can only get to them. My browser shows comments. How do we know when it will show and when it won't? You know what? Some browsers behave very differently. What I would say to you is comments are all right. Comments are good, but just know that some browsers may show them. So don't put anything security risk or anything you know, that may be exposed. So if you need to put some very generic comment to another developer, that's fine. I don't think anybody would know what, you know, nobody would care that you know, this is GST, HST. That's fine. So what I'm saying is there's potential for your comments to be shown always. Just don't put anything important in there, like something that could expose your team or company or workplace. You know, if it's something that nobody else cares about or knows any context from, that's fine. Just be careful. Which is the difference between head? What is the difference between the head and header tag? Okay, so the head tag is for the browser. The head tag is very important. When the browser loads up, the browser is going to look at that head tag, and it's going to get the metadata, get any of the important things it needs to, the assets that it needs to load up for the page, like external JavaScript files, CSS files, all that stuff. Header tags are more internal to the body. Now, you got to remember though, there's a lot of old tags floating around. There's HTML2 tags and HTML1. If there are header tags in place of that, those could be depreciated tags. And there's a lot of depreciated tags out there. So what happens if we write some content after head and before meta? So we're talking about, let's see here, we're talking about if we put some tags before the head and for the meta and before that, so you're saying in the, so if we put something up top here, you know, it may not gain importance. Like if you wanted to put some CSS reference outside of this, the browser may try to figure out what you're trying to do. It may try to have some unexpected behavior. It may not reference it the way you want it. If you put like a paragraph tag above the head, it's not going to break it. It may try to reshuffle it. You may just get some unexpectedness, right? Just know that it looks here first and then moves down the tree. So yeah, you may just get some very unexpected behavior there. All right, and what was the other one? Okay, that was that question there. All right, sorry. Let me put this to everybody. All right. So my point was, you're going to be looking at this HTML guide, this reference, a lot. And in here, it has everything you can want and all the tags. I'm not going to go through them all. I'm going to try to go through the important ones, but you know, we're talking about the head tag here, right? So we're going to click on the header tag. It's going to give us some information here, right? The metadata, document, title, scripts, style sheets. Header primarily holds information for machine processing, not human readability. For human visible information, use top-level tags like header. There we go. Top-level tags like header. So that answered my question. For human visible, use the header tag. For the head, that's for the machine. So let's look at the header tag. Header tag, so it looks to me like it's inside of the body, represents an introductory content, typically a group of introductory navigation aids. So here we have this thing here about puppies or whatever. So, and this is kind of an attribute for CSS, but we're not looking at that yet. But you can tell it's very different. So it may contain a logo or search form or something that's kind of at the top, which is much different than our head tag, which has a lot of more information, right? And more global attributes that we may know. A note, HTML5 compliant browsers, which we're talking about as modern browsers, automatically create a head tag for us. That's incredible. This auto creation cannot be guaranteed in ancient browsers. That's what I'm trying to get at. What is an ancient browser? Okay, so that's going to go and talk more about that. I'll let you read that. Ancient browsers mean IE5, A6. If you notice, the browser are already smart enough to kind of backfill some stuff for us. The older ones don't do that. So anyhow, getting back to this, MDB, this MDN, sorry, this document network or HTML is going to have everything you need that we already talked about, and there's a lot of tags in there. I encourage you to go and really look through some of this stuff, right? And there's a lot of tags in there, and we're going to step through some of them. We're getting ahead of ourselves, but just know everything we're talking about has a description and a code sample here, right? Grandma's favorite heavy metal band, Grandma's Heavy Metal Festival Journal. That's the title of that document. No comment there. Okay, anyhow, getting back to what we were talking about. We have a few more slides. I've been talking for a little bit, kind of going over a little bit, but we'll get through this. All right, so structure is very important. If you were to tell me when I work on a web page, do I automatically type this all out? I would say no, I don't, because I don't need to. I just need to know what everything does. Sometimes I just go and get a template quickly, grab it, and then use it. Because once I got the template right, I never have to change the structure of the document. It's already there for me. Structure really doesn't change unless you maybe are modifying, you may be adding different attributes, different metadata inside the head tag, but rarely will you go and cut the head tag completely and move it under the body. Once you have this nice structure, it's your template and you go from there. It kind of translates to this. This is what a page structure looks like. So this is, again, just kind of visualizing it, that it's a tree. And that tree structure is important because, especially when we get into selectors in CSS, we use them, we need to sometimes traverse this tree. Sometimes we need to select, the third level paragraph, or we need to select the top level parent. So there's something in CSS3 called selectors. There's a whole language library called jQuery in JavaScript that's based on selectors and then based on this tree. So you need to think of a HTML page structure as a tree. And you can think of HTML as the parent. Then we have a child head tag that has a child nested element that's a title, right? And then we kind of block this off as that's the head block, the header block that the machine reads. Then we get into the visual representation of the body. Inside the body, we may have nested children, which therefore has nested elements, and so on and so forth. Kind of like a branch of a tree with leaves. You can think of it that way. And each child branch may have smaller branches and may have leaves of their own, and so on and so forth, right? And sometimes we need to traverse that tree. And that's where things get very interesting. All right, so kind of segue into that. So HTML and trees. So elements can go inside of other elements, as we have already said. Content isn't just text, but it can also be other HTML elements. Division elements are used to group chunks of content. So the div tag is called a division element. The div tag can be used as a very good placeholder along with CSS. You may not even need to use paragraphs anymore when you get really good at it. And there's a lot of things that you can solve when you start mixing styles into the mix, right? But again, we're spending reality right now and just learning markup. So let's not jump ahead too far. But in this example, H1 is the child element of the div tag. We can reorganize this so that the structure is more clear, right? So this point, as I was trying to get at, was you could have a bunch of HTML elements that are all in one line, copy pasted across all the lines, which is very unreadable. Or you can kind of, as you're working, kind of add some tabbing to it to try to signify that there are elements there in your code base, right? Case in point, so if I'm building out this kind of this file, as I'm going in here, I might have nested divs, right? And I may have nested divs, and as you can see, my editor is automatically adding tabbing for me, which I love, right? And inside of that, if I paste it, now I have a little bit of a problem here. So I have to kind of highlight everything and maybe use my tabbing, right? To kind of maybe create this kind of kind of flow, right? I forget what they call it again. It's called Christmas tree, kind of a Christmas tree effect that you're kind of getting, right? So the nested children are kind of, so now that's so much better to the eye now. When I look at that, I can kind of tell exactly what's going on there, and I can match up. Hey, if I select this right here, if you can tell my Visual Studio Code is highlighted, the matching closing tag for me, which is really great, especially if it's a very long kind of document. As I'm going down, you can see, okay, we've kind of messed up this tagging a bit. Now there's an orphan tag sitting here, which we don't want. In fact, we don't want this one. So that's probably better, right? And this should probably be all in one line just to be clean. So now we have a nice kind of clean structure there. And I think I saw in my IDE here, if you notice now, I can collapse it. Look at that, beautiful, right? So now I can collapse the children elements. I can collapse, if they're closed properly, I can kind of work my way up the tree, right? So now you can kind of organize yourself if you're working on big files. Whereas in Notepad, you can't do that. We're kind of stuck with this, right? So that's the main reason why you would want to use an IDE. But if you're good and you understand this stuff and you have good tabbing, then maybe you can quickly use Notepad or some other text editor. All right, so anyhow, let's finish up. How many slides I got? I got about, oh, okay, got 10 more. All right, let me speed up here. All right, so HTML and trees, we already went through that. So the document, HTML document can be thought of as a template, which we kind of already alluded to, or I kind of mentioned that in the other slide. It can be broken down into 3 parts: doc type, header tag, head tag, and body. So the doc type describes the type of HTML where there are technically different types. For 99.99% of HTML, you're right, you'll likely be fine with this. It's true. Rarely do you change it. I've seen XHTML, but rarely do you change that on the web. Right? It's kind of standard. But it is possible to change it. Header tag, again, to reiterate, describes the meta information about the site, metadata such as title, script links, say to a JavaScript, say React, maybe React script or some kind of external CDN, which is content delivery, style sheets the site needs, all this stuff to render it and behave correctly. If you don't have the information or you cut out that information, you have a very rich looking site, you're going to get a flat site because that site is going to start to is not going to know where to, it's going to start to break because it's not going to have those assets available. The body tag, as we talked about, describes the actual content of the site that the users will see. All right, so I kind of talked about that. HTML documents continuing. So omitting some of that information doesn't necessarily mean that the page won't display. In fact, your browser will assume certain parts. If you have a modern browser, it'll try to backfill what it knows. If you accidentally leave it out, it'll try to figure it out. So take this line, for example. Some of you might have noticed that if you just have a document that has just that element, if you look at the browser, it'll try to figure out, it'll inspect it and it'll try to build the basic template for you. So you may have noticed that in your browser, it added the template for you, right? And it put that inside of the body. An older browser would not do that. An older browser may just have the element floating there and may behave not as you would expect. All right. So this is kind of a blurry object. We already know this. This is from our dev tools, what this dev tools may look like, Chrome developer tools. So there's different color schemes. This looks like a Firefox version of it. You have a tab right here called Elements. We may have looked at it, and you have a little inspector icon here, and you can inspect elements of the page. And this would be a bigger kind of document than we've been looking at. You'll see here that it has the doc type HTML. It has the HTML tag with a bunch of attributes. So this, we'll get into attributes again, but it has a language for English. Class, now that class is a CSS class, and it'll know what to do about that. And of course, the header tag is kind of collapsed. We have our body tag. It has an attribute on it, a couple attributes actually. Has an ID. Sometimes you need an ID. Again, for when you get into like selecting, you may need an ID on some of these branches to tell them the difference when you're selecting them, right? That maybe you might want to select the element that is like the container. You might have a division, a div element that maybe is the main content, and then you may have another one that's like a footer. So you may need an ID to differentiate them. Instead of trying to select the top one and all that stuff, it gets really messy, right? A couple span tags in there, an iframe. So our developer tools, we already know this part of it. This is all CSS here, which we haven't got to, but and then it has kind of this kind of box here for CSS, right? So you can tell there's something called margin, something called border, something called padding, and it gives different units and properties for all of those styles. And there's more, because once you get into all these tabs, console, source, network, performance, memory, each one of these tabs has some information, very crucial information for our purposes, right? So doc types, as we already talked about, but let's hammer it home. An HTML document usually starts with this type declaration, which is not a tag, so it should not have a closing tag. This declaration helps the browser determine what type of HTML document it's trying to parse and display, right? If you've ever looked at an older website, that's what I was trying to remember, an older website. Maybe if we look at Space Jam, we might want to see what they have. You'll notice different doc types look like this. So I remember these old doc types. So doc type, HTML public, W3C, DTD. I remember this. This is what I was trying to remember. HTML 4.1, English, and then it has some other reference to W3org, which is the organization that is the standard for HTML. But I remember this old school docs. Or maybe you don't see this anymore. Sometimes there's a mode called Quarks mode, which sometimes the browsers go into, which is bad. You can read more about browsers in Quarks mode, but if they don't see a doc type, they kind of don't know what to interpret, right? They have a bit of a problem with your page. So doc type is good. We need it. Continuing on, newer websites and your website or the web pages we're going to build, we need a doc declaration like this. So nicely defined doc type HTML triggers standard mode with all the updated features. So then the browser knows it's going to be operating in standard mode, which is modern, and Quarks mode is not. It's bad. So browsers look for the doc type declaration to determine which rendering mode it uses to render the site. So it has a couple modes to render, and you're telling it up front on the very first line that you want it to render standard. Generally, newer sites follow this standard HTML specification. Current standard HTML specification is called HTML5, which we're learning right now, HTML5. Older sites, on the other hand, standards never really existed. So we might have been out of luck then, might use different rendering mode that imitates behavior of old browsers, which is not what we want. We want modern. So once we declare the doc type, the next part, obviously, as we said, is the HTML tag. Tells that everything inside of it is going to be parsed as HTML. And then we have two main sections of the HTML document, the head and the body. And it looks like this. Look at that. Wow, looks like a tree, doesn't it? And you should get used to the fact that we need to think of this as a tree. This is the full HTML tree structure. As you can see, the parent, and then two sections here. We break off in the header, we break off into the body. Header does its thing. We have multiple, meta tags, links, maybe not so much nested, but just multiple on the same level. But then as we get into the body, then we have many nested tags. As you can see, here's a navigation bar that has an unordered list that has a list items that has anchors. You would never have to draw this out. It's just good to visualize it because, as I mentioned before, you may be using selectors and you might have to select, the third most list anchor child. And when you get into that kind of thing, sometimes it helps to draw it out, to be honest. But yeah, you may need to apply a style down here on this lower level links. And you may need to do it on a button click or some kind of user action. You may need to toggle the menu. You may need to toggle the navigation bar and disable the links, something like that, and that's where the tree comes in handy. So just to go a little bit in depth, I know we talked about this a lot, but let's kind of finish it home here. So all the HTML syntax we've learned in this lesson, right, it's going to be the content of the page, which is always contained in the body tags, and the body is always visible. The head on the other hand, as we said, is never visible. It's for the browser, and the browser needs it to render correctly. And that's what the head is responsible for. The following: the document title, which we said, that can show up in the browser tabs, associated CSS files for styles. Now, we never looked at this, but this is kind of what it looks like. You're going to have a link tag, and it has another attribute that says it's a style sheet, and the type is text CSS, and then href is a link. So it's going to be the location or target is going to be style.css. That would be how you would pull in a CSS file inside of the header tag. And the browser will know, okay, I got to pull this out of this file, and it'll try to go download it. And you'll see it in your browser, Chrome, and maybe I'll show you that. You'll see all the assets coming in. Also, associated JavaScript files need to be rendered, right? So we have script tag, animations, and all that. That also needs to be there. Character sets, so the metadata, that's encoding, so meta char set. So we're saying the encoding for this page is going to be UTF-8. I'm not sure when you would change that character set. Maybe if it's some accessibility or something like that. Keywords, authors, descriptions. So keywords and description are good for SEO. SEO is search engine optimization, right? There are a lot of there's a concept called spiders out there. Or crawlers, if you don't know what that is, like if you submit a website to Google, it has these applications that'll go and crawl, which means it'll take your website and start to parse it, try to look for information. That's why it's very important in the meta tags. It'll look for a description, updated content to see what the website's all about for your ranking in your Google, your listings, right? The more often you update pages, the more often the crawlers update them. And it helps there's a whole businesses based around rankings and search engine optimization. And I tell you, when you hire them, they really go through your meta tags of your site and really do a lot of stuff like that to make you appear at the top. So meta tags are important. So just to kind of hammer that home, meta charset UTF-8 is pretty standard. Will allow your website to display any Unicode character. So we can look more on how UTF-8 works if you're interested there. The title will define the title in the document in the browser tab window, as we said. So that explains that. And to be honest, once you have that there, you're not going to change it much, but it's very important to know about. All right, so I think this last slide. So if you're doing your work, you can use this validator, and that validator will look at this quickly. We copy this validator here, and let's take a look. All right, so you can validate directly some HTML that you may have already worked on. So let's quickly grab this text here, and we will paste it in there and we'll do a check on it and make sure that it's valid. So if we click check, it'll go through and say, it'll give us some information on some of our tags. It'll give us some information maybe that you know, there's some problems with our comments. So these are giving us warnings, but that's necessarily a bad thing. But okay, so we have a couple errors here we have to figure out. So it's saying error tag, start tag, seen without seeing a doc type first, right? So it's telling us that we don't even have a doc type, so it's already giving us a problem with this HTML, which is fine. We didn't actually add this, right? So it's enforcing the fact that we need a doc type. So, all right, now it's going to go through and tell us, all right, of course, we're missing a header tag because we don't have a header tag. So we should probably go and shore this up, to be honest, because now we should probably have our HTML. We should probably close it. HTML. We should probably add our header tag and close the header tag. We should probably add a body tag and then close the body tag, right? If we just had that, let's see if we ran a check on it. Would that be valid? All right. It's going to give us a warning because it's going to say, okay, it's good. It says element head is missing a required instance of the child element title. All right, so it's telling us that, you know, we should have a title here. That's good. All right, so we should have a title, XYZ title. Let's validate that. Let's make sure we have no errors. Okay, error. End of file seen when expecting text or an end tag. End of file seen. So already it doesn't really like my template, right? So it doesn't really like what I got. So why not, let's just go to one of this, let's use our MDM here and try to find something that it likes, right? So if we have a header tag and, all right, so surely it should like this. This is right from MDN. If it doesn't like this, then we're in trouble. Or maybe it's really, really a good thing. All right, so no errors. All right, so no errors. It's saying there's a warning. Okay, it's saying you should consider adding a language tag. All right, so that's telling us that, you know, maybe we should have language equals English. And can we get rid of all the errors? Yes, no errors. All good. No errors or no warnings to show. All right. So this validator quickly showed us gave us some tips on our documentation. So I encourage you to use a validator when you're doing your work, especially when you get into big documents. It can really help you a lot. And help do some fact checking on your work as you're going, right? You'll learn a lot that way by going. Now you don't have to clear all the warnings, but you should definitely clear all the errors. And so I would encourage you to use this validator when you're doing your work. All right, so let me quickly stop there. Stop recording at least.